Good morning, everybody. Welcome to week 2. There are several things we want to discuss today. Number one of them is where are we going with our with our course this week. And so I wanted to look a little bit at your course outline today and talk about the different activities that are online for this week. Okay, so while I'm getting there, we can look at week 2. And notice there's a couple of videos in here. One of them is a walkthrough of the Researched Exegetical Paper book. Now remember that book is in the top section of the course and you can get to it any time. And each of the weekly assignments that have to do with the paper is linked back to that book. So my suggestion is to go to the very last section, which is the 5th assignment. Have a look at what your final paper is meant to be as sort of an orienting way of looking at it, rather than starting at the beginning and then finding a surprise at the end. Because really all of the pieces and parts we're doing over the course of the term end up going to that final paper. So be sure you have looked through the exegetical paper book all the way to the end and understand where the paper actually is heading. The second item this week is a YouTube clip to Thomas Tallis, Lamentazione. It's a really nice example of lamentation in early church music. And if you listen to it carefully, you'll be able to hear him singing the lament over Jerusalem, which comes from the book of Lamentations, but comes then through Christian theology, through Jesus weeping over Jerusalem. And so we hear this played during Holy Week. If you're in a very formal sort of church setting, oftentimes this comes up then. It gives a real feel for what lamenting is all about. And so that's something nice to listen to for a reception history approach to lamentation. The third item down is the Lament as Genre, Lament as Activity Forum. This will be sort of the main forum for the week. So you might want to have a look at the question that's in there. And as you're reading, think about how you will approach the forum prompt for the week. The third one is another little person with a bubble over its head. Paper Project 1, Choosing a Psalm. This is where you get to show off your work for the week to your group mates. So you're divided up into groups and you'll have a few people that you're going to be working with over the course of the term. So we'll do that and have you working in groups for that. And then the next part is the same title. Notice that the title is the same. Paper Project Assignment 1, Choosing a Psalm, but the format is different. And what you're going to do is turn that one into me as a assignment. And that way I can download all those assignments in a list and work through them to grade the assignment itself. So you'll have actually 2 grades going on for the paper project this week. You'll have one for interacting with your group. You'll have a second one for your own work on that. And then I've added for you week 2 resources. So I'm putting in there a few files, and there, click on the file and you'll see the different ones you can download. One of them is a simple text world information PDF, which is a little bit complicated and heady, and don't worry if you can't scan through that and make sense of it, because we'll talk about parts of that as we're going along here. And then the second one is the week 2 lecture information PDF that goes along with this lecture here. So you'll have something in hard copy. It's just simply not possible to lecture at the iPhone for a whole lecture. So I wanted to give you lots of information, and I've included it all in the same PDF so you can use that for the week's information rather than having to contend with lots of other smaller separate PDFs. So in there you'll also have sort of a rough draft of what I'm working on for the Story of God commentary on Psalms 1 and Psalms 2. Those were 2 Psalms I wanted to talk about with you last week a little bit, and we got slightly distracted. And so what we want to look at is Psalms 1 and 2 briefly as 2 Psalms that come to us at the very beginning of the Psalter. It has to do with the editing of the Psalter, so we'll get to that after a while. Okay, so that is basically some information on where we're going this week. And I just wanted to remind you that the paper project assignment, it comes you do one file, but it goes 2 different places. And that's simply because I'm like on the move a lot. And so I like to be able to download and grade your papers while I'm running around. Okay, so let's move on then to the actual information that's on that lecture sheet. It's kind of long. I think it was like 15 pages. So we're not, of course, going to talk through the whole thing. But we did talk a little bit last week about approaches to the Psalms, and I introduced you to the quote by C.S. Lewis, which is in this particular lecture. And the two things that are being focused upon here are contending with method. What method are we going to use to read? How are we going to understand what we're reading? Will we go with, for example, Anderson and look at this through genre criticism? Will we go with Gillingham and look at it through interpretive history? Will we go through any other kind of way of looking at it, other types of readings that you may have heard of? And my suggestion is that while the interpretive history of the Psalms is pretty huge, we can learn to do a good reading and create a synthesis between, for example, literary and linguistic approaches, and then add our history and culture as we can find it. One of the problems with the Psalms are that there's not a lot of historical information that actually is attached to each one of them. So there are essentially 150 small pieces of text which may or may not be hooked together by topic as you go through. You'll see some fit together by topic and some don't. It's a little bit like looking at the hymn book, which has a very good history of composition, and a hymn book nowadays is put together for the church year or that kind of thing. And so you'll see an organizational principle to it. And this is where Gerald Wilson was going with his canonical look, is to ask, is it just stuff put together to use in the temple, or is there some kind of a logical flow to the entire 5 books that are found in the bigger book of the Psalms? Okay, so we want to be able to read well, and in order to read well, we'll have to look at individual Psalms and the way they lay in the bigger book of Psalms. And I tend to lean to Wilson's side of things and think there's definitely an organizational principle at work, although I'm not so sure that it was a single psalmist that did that. I'm sort of one that thinks there is a long history of editing that has gone on. So the fact that they do fit together the way they do and make some sense in the way that they do is quite an interesting thing. Okay, so you can read Lewis on the Psalms in this lecture, which is where I drew the quote from last week. And we can compare Lewis then with Alter, who most of you now have had a chance to look at Alter's first section on parallelism. And Alter has a really literary approach to parallelism. Okay, oftentimes what happens in a course such as this is we go back to Bishop Louth's categories of parallelism and start looking at lines and how they fit together, and are they synonymous and are they antithetic and how do they fit together, and as if that was a system that was in place that poets chose from. And for this class, I've turned 2 things on their head. The first one is to turn on the head the idea that we must follow Louth's categories before we begin to read in a literary sort of way. So I've wanted you to engage with Alter because he is a literary reader, and he does cover the topics that the synonymous and antithetic and all of that sort of parallelism do, but he doesn't start there. He starts with text as literature, so he's not trying to subdivide the whole too quickly. 2 other people that you might want to read if you're interested in reading more about parallelism from a linguistic perspective, and that would be Adele Berlin's book called, I have my phone sitting on it, The Dynamics of Biblical Parallelism, which is available probably through the library. Alternatively, to getting the book, you can go back to that link that I put into last week's Waiting for Alter entry into the course announcements, because there's a link that takes you to a very good essay written by Berlin that contains her introductory stuff to parallelism. She does a really nice job of including a linguistic approach along with everything else, and so you'll get a good feel for what's going on with parallelism that way. The counter voice to Alter, which you've probably picked up on, is James Kugel, The Idea of Biblical Poetry. And this book was fairly formative when I took my own Psalms classes. And he's the one that says a line of poetry is A and what's more B. So he looks for progression between 2 lines of poetry. And that really is not sufficient to introduce you to the idea of parallelism. So we'll go back on that as a topic as we move along. But I did not want to start with parallelism as a system. I wanted you to encounter your Psalms as pieces of literature. So we're starting from a little bit of a different place than a lot of people would as far as dealing with parallelism. There's lots out there, so you are not going to be starving for information on parallelism until I get to giving you a short lecture probably next week. However, we do want to look at this as poems, as literature, as songs, as things that are not static per se. The meaning of psalm is kind of progresses as we hear the music. It progresses as we hear the poetry. And so hearing poetry is a little bit different than analyzing poetry. So first of all, we want to encounter it, and then we'll go back and backtrack a little bit and be a little bit more critical on those things that have been traditionally at the top of the list. We moved them down one notch here. Now, I'm big on text world theory. This is something that I found when I was writing my PhD work, and I really liked it as a sort of comprehensive guideline for reading. It gets a little wordy, so we're not going to encounter the whole thing today, but the thing I liked about it is that it's a consistent approach. So you get a way to look at a piece of text as a whole and moving through that text. And what does that do as we're reading? I was curious about the reading process. We layer different things in there. What things are added? What things are left out? Sometimes that's a good question to ask. Why did they choose this word over that word? Why did they choose this idea over that? And we've already encountered a little bit of that in Alter, where he talks about that idea of progression going from general to specific, which of course is a good rhetorical technique as well. So I've given you a little bit of an introduction to text world theory and the idea that it's very much how do we uptake on text in our mind as we're reading. So the three interrelated ways that these can contribute to our conversation there are three different things here. So each aspect of it is oriented to how we create meaning. Okay, so as we're talking together here, I'm talking to my phone and I'm assuming you're reading and listening and hearing. We're sort of in a more or less normal, but not really quite normal, discourse world. That's what Paul Worth would call it. If you were sitting across the table from your best friend or your spouse or at a coffee shop with another friend talking, that would be a pretty normal discourse world. You'd be sharing the same environment and you'd be face to face. You'd be in the same time frame. You'd probably be about the same temperature, all kinds of small things that we don't really think about as how different we are. Our class is one step away from that. We're asynchronic. We have good conversations with one another, but it's the turn taking in a conversation that takes a longer time. There's a long turnover between when you write something in your forum and perhaps I'll go in and make a comment, then a little while later, or a day later, and then you go back and do it again. It's a little bit more like playing telephone, but nonetheless, we're still in our particular form of a discourse world. Now, when we're reading, that's even farther apart. And you get a split discourse world, us with the original author. And there's a lot of context and culture that we just don't have immediate access to, but we do tend to be able to recreate something in our own mind, which is in a way sort of amazing. And the Psalms are particularly good for this because there's so much first-person reference. Okay, so that's one reason why they're so approachable, is that we can really identify with the I and thou of God that gets put in there. Now, as far as text world theory goes, there's three things. There's something called world builders. Okay, how are we going to create an understanding of what we're talking about? This is building the discourse world. Then within that world, we have something called function advancing propositions, which is a fancy way of saying verbal sentences. Okay, so we get the world sort of started. Once upon a time, there was, and then we go on and we start telling the story. It's much more easily available in a narrative. In a poem, there's a lot of things that are actually presupposed, and that's where a poem will oftentimes jump in presupposing you already know what that world is all about. Okay, and that's why it gets a little interesting. Now, one way that I would say the editors, perhaps the authors, but the editors of the Psalms include some world builders, and they disambiguate that whole issue by putting in the superscriptions. Okay, so some of you will have a psalm that has, this is a maskil of David, or that kind of thing. Those things include as part of the world building process. And so it's easier to move around with the idea. And I'm thinking particularly Psalm 3, where it gives a good information about where that psalm might have been written or why it might have been written. Now, there's also something really fascinating in here, and that's called world switching. And that's where we end up getting perspective other than perhaps the psalmist. And so you get world switching going on a lot in Psalm 2 by verbal sentences such as I said, or he said to me, or God has sworn. All of those are verbal sentences based on semantics of speech. We'll get to that a little bit more. And that's very important because every time we have that, we've now got sort of a focal point. If we ask who's talking, we can ask a lot about their context, their culture, their surroundings, their setting. And if particularly if the person is named, we end up with a lot more information at the presuppositional level than we would have had before. So what we're going to do, basically the way these work is they align with the journalist 5 questions: who, what, when, where, why. But they add nuance. Okay, so the first thing about the world builders, these are things that you'll just look for in a good close reading anyway. You look for the time, when was it written, okay, or any other time indicators. Where was it written, or where was it written about? Look for characters, who are the main speakers, and then objects. Okay, so objects, then thing would be inanimate sorts of things, or a lot of times in Psalms are going to be abstract things like justice or righteousness and that kind of thing. So the world builders tend to cover the journalist when, where, and who. Okay. And grammatically speaking, you can look at for grammar hints. If you're into Hebrew, you'll want to look at a little bit more about the grammar that's in here. But it's sufficient to say we're looking for world builders. So we want to name the characters. We want to see if we can name the time frame or the location. Psalms, this gets really hard. And then we want to talk about what kind of objects are in there, because the objects are really cool. They oftentimes participate in metaphor, which is very, very fun. So we end up with animals that are acting up. The animals are actually stand-ins sometimes for other leaders, that kind of thing. So objects, the sword can be a metonymy for a person at war, and so forth and so on. So those are interesting things to isolate and pay attention to. You know, are we talking about David, or are we talking about Solomon, and so forth and so on. Okay, once you've got that figured out, you can look at how the verbal aspects of the psalm come into play. Now this again for poetry is tricky because Hebrew verbal system doesn't really give a present tense, and yet you'll read Psalms and they'll oftentimes be in present tense. So what's going on in there sometimes is something that's happened in translation. So there's a lot of stuff in there that you could go and delve into. Now, the interesting thing about it, and the thing we want to pay attention to, is these world switching ideas, because this is where we get a switch in character, gives us a switch in perspective. Okay, so if we're talking at one point from the king's perspective, and then we're talking another point from the observer's perspective, we're seeing these shifts around in perspective that our mind does it, but oftentimes we don't necessarily. Let's write that down, but it's very interesting when you begin to do that. I've given you a few fancy linguistic-y words in here, but basically what we're saying is the idea of semantics of desire, belief, or purpose. The Lord has sworn he will not change his mind. We have something going in there with the idea of God swearing, but also the not mind changing. In other words, my mind is made up that this is going to happen. This is opening up another sort of a smaller world within your bigger world of seeing into God's mind. Okay, he's not going to change his mind there. We also have something called attitudinal world shift. Okay, so if we have thinking, seeing, hearing, knowing, or believing, I think that is different than it is the case that. Okay, so there's a lot of discussion going on now in the outside world about different things politically speaking, and sometimes you'll find people stating a categorical statement where and it's really off-putting. Whereas if they said, I think that, I believe that, now you've got an anchor point for that. And you can then have a really nice discussion, because then you can go back and forth and go, well, I think that this is the case, rather than it is the case. Categorical statements can be a little bit challenging that way. Okay. Finally, well, there's 2 more things. If you have possibility, probability, or hypotheticals, that's a world shift in itself. Okay, so if you're saying, if this happens, what will you do, is very different than saying, what do you do? What do you think? So that idea of hypotheticals is a legitimate difference from a frank, all-out statement of something. And finally, the one we're going to look at quite often here is the idea of speech frames. How is a poem framed? Who's doing the talking? Okay, it's very easy to assume David's doing all the talking all the way through because we've heard of David as the sweet psalmist of Israel and that kind of thing. But because a psalm says to David or whatever, it's a little bit more obscure than that because, well, we could say opaque because that to in Hebrew can also be of or for or by, okay, or written to or toward. So the word that we see in our English Bible gives us a little more certainty than actually is there in the Hebrew. So David most certainly is associated with many, many, many of these, especially in the first book. But we want to pay attention to other authors who are mentioned and other kinds of things like that, because that can be indication of who's speaking. And then, of course, the psalmist sometimes will quote somebody else, or the voice seems to change, but we don't necessarily have a way to know who it shifted to. So pay good attention to that. We'll talk a little bit about that on Psalm 2 in a future discussion here. Okay? So then the next and the final point on this particular recording is going to be the idea of genre. The first person to do a genre study is Hermann Gunkel, and his work is still available. It's still really good. It's kind of the seminal work on taking